So I want to move on now to look at sort of some of the patterns. Really, I've been talking about individual children, individual examples of discrimination. And this is not to in any way sideline the individual duties, but there are really important duties which are more strategic, if you like, in as much as they don't just look at individual children, they look at patterns. And so these wider duties are really important in setting a better framework within which we need to make those individual adjustments. And it can, over time, of course, can reduce the need to make individual adjustments. It's a little bit going back to that Lani Florian point about the sort of inclusive nature of schools. If we can make our general provision more inclusive, we need to make fewer individual adjustments, and those individual adjustments have the risk associated with them of singling children out and making their treatment look different in a context where actually you want more of a focus on the generality. So this is where the patterns here are quite important. So why do we need some of these wider duties? Well, the big picture for disabled pupils is that they are overrepresented in persistent absence figures, exclusions, bullying, off-rolling, elective home education, when they leave school not in education, employment or training. There's the NEETs figures, and they are underrepresented in attainment, participation in activities beyond the school day, which is quite important because that often provides the opportunity for disabled pupils to succeed at something where there may be challenges in the classroom. They can maybe succeed in something that is beyond the school days, as it were, sort of more the range of different activities they may be able to participate in beyond the school day, and they're often less well represented in those activities. Underrepresented in socializing with their peers, and I'm going to come back to some of those things later. School trips they're often left out of, quite often excluded from PE, sometimes because the school has decided that a child needs physiotherapy at the time that the other pupils are doing PE, because it's seen as some kind of substitute for, but actually, rather than adjusting the PE so that the child can be included almost as part of their physiotherapy, if you like, and often underrepresented in posts of responsibility in schools. So, for example, and I'm not going to go through all of the data here, but we know, for example, that disabled pupils are much more likely to be bullied. And it's really quite shocking. Look at that point. There's over 90% of parents of children with Asperger's syndrome reported their child had been bullied in the previous 12 months. That's massive. Young people with speech difficulties 3 times more likely to be bullied than their peers. And 70% of children with autistic spectrum disorders, combined with other characteristics, have experience of bullying. And the MenCap survey says 9 in 10 people with a learning disability surveyed had experience of harassment in the past year, and 1 in 3 of them saying that bullying was the thing that worried them most when going out. And it's quite shocking that we are, in effect, not enabling people with a learning disability to go out and be part of their local community because of their experiences. And this data about the exclusions of very young children from school. This is the taller red bars of 5-year-olds who are excluded from school. The shorter blue bars of 4-year-olds and under. Now, these are fixed term exclusions, but there are also permanent exclusions of 5-year-olds and 4-year-olds and under. But what is particularly shocking about this, though, is that if you look at 2016-17, that's almost exactly 7,000 children 7,000 exclusions of 5-year-olds in 2016-17, but those exclusions related to between 2,500 and 3,000 children. therefore, on average, those children were being excluded 2.6 times as 5-year-olds. So it means on average, many of those children only been excluded once, so some of them probably been excluded 5 or 6 times as 5-year-olds, which is really quite shocking to me, that at the very early in their school career, they're having that experience of, in effect, being told they don't belong there. The schools have not been able to make adjustments to enable them to be included. And we've had all sorts of other data about children being in elective home education, and disproportionate number of those children have special educational needs or disadvantage, known to social care, or a combination of those things. The research by the EPI and National Education Union found that there were more than 69,000 unexplained exits by over 61,000 pupils. This is in the secondary stages, with many of those failing to return to the school system ever again, and that pupils with SEN were more likely to experience an unexplained exit. Now, we are getting more savvy about this in the data, and there is the growing demand that actually we monitor not just official exclusions, but that we monitor the movement of pupils around the system, including coming out of school altogether. And then, of course, there are poorer outcomes for those children who are out of school. And the point from the researchers here saying that, of course, pupils who leave the school can have a flattering impact on school results, which their calculations around that makes a significant difference to schools' results if you included those children who were off-rolled. So in connection with these patterns, we have some strategic duties on schools. And just to have a quick look at these, some of the key ones are accessibility planning duties, the public sector equality duty, and there are some sort of overlapping responsibilities between SEN policies and requirements on for an SEN information report, and responsibilities to pupils with medical needs. So the reason that these I call them the strategic duties, because they're duties towards the pupil population collectively, rather than those individual duties to make sure we're making reasonable adjustments. Why are they important? Well, because of the very things that we've just talked about, those patterns that are problematic. So I'm just going to go through those different duties one after the other. So here's another opportunity for you just to stick a few thoughts into the chat, please. Can you identify 3 different aspects of accessibility that have to be covered in a school accessibility plan? So into the chat, any of your thoughts about what may be covered by school accessibility planning duties? Reshmi, thank you very much. Access to the curriculum, spot on. And we don't necessarily, as schools don't necessarily think of access to the curriculum in connection with accessibility. Very often it's thought of as being physical accessibility. Well, there you go, I've just given you another one there. So thank you, Diana, spot on. There's the 3rd one. It's the one that people often don't know about. So there are 3 key elements in the accessibility planning duty. 1, the access to the physical environment. 2, access to the curriculum. And 3, access to information. And that's access to information for disabled pupils. So thinking of different formats in which we might need to provide information, rather than access to information for the parents. And schools often don't think of that issue about access to information in connection with pupils. They think of, yes, of course, we send information home, so they tend to think of information for parents, but information for pupils in classrooms and around the school, and advertising events, etc., etc. All of that is subject to that accessibility requirement in the accessibility planning duties. So let me just move on. So 3 elements: the physical environment, curriculum, and information for disabled pupils. Let's, in a little bit more detail, the curriculum duty is about increasing the extent to which disabled pupils can participate in the school's curriculum. Now, that makes it very clear in the duties that that is not just about access to history on a Monday morning. This is about the school's curriculum in the broadest sense. So it's access to all the different activities and access to all the things that happen in between lessons, as well as the things that happen in lessons. Then, in terms of the physical environment, again, this isn't just about getting into and out of the school, as it were. This isn't just about sort of ramps and doorways, if you see what I mean. This is about improving the physical environment so that disabled pupils can benefit from what the school provides. So, for example, a school that was recently wanted to reorganize its playground took into account the fact that some children needed quieter areas where they would feel less intimidated by the big, boisterous, noisy games going on in a larger open area. And so that was an improvement to the physical environment, so that some disabled pupils could benefit from that recreational time of the day, but not then be, as it were, subjected to conditions that would mean they couldn't, they would find that difficult to tolerate. Then information for disabled pupils is about improving the delivery of information which is readily accessible to pupils who are not disabled. So it might be simplifying the language for a pupil with a learning disability. It might be putting it into a larger font for a pupil with a visual impairment. And interestingly, in combination, those 3 elements really cover so much of school life, and obviously can help us enormously with avoiding the need for those individual reasonable adjustments if we can get the right approach across the whole school. And just a small point about accessibility plans: schools are required to publish them, to allocate resources to them, to implement them, to review them, revise them as necessary, and are required to publish a new plan every 3 years. Now, those duties came in, I think the first plans had to be published in 2003. So last year, 2021, schools should all have been publishing their new revised 3-year plan. I think so long as plans are being reviewed and revised every 3 years, probably most people will be very happy with that. But most of the plans that I've looked at have a kind of continuing effect without any clear criteria that the school is going to achieve. So, for example, it would say in connection with curriculum accessibility, it would say something like differentiation of lesson materials, and then who, when, and how, but then say when continuing, who, all staff, etc. And it's clearly there's no specific analysis of where there may be restrictions in terms of accessibility. So, for example, more children getting kicked out of a maths lesson than an art lesson, for example. Well, we need to look at what's happening in that maths lesson. How can we make that maths lesson more accessible to pupils so that more of them can stay in that maths lesson and enjoy the learning in that lesson? So Public sector equality duty is the other big duty that I mentioned. And again, why? Well, because of those patterns of patterns that amount to discrimination, but because they are never challenged individually, they may persist. So we've already said all of that. I say it again, these are the factors where children, disabled pupils, are going to be overrepresented in the undesirable figures and underrepresented in the desirable figures. So the public sector equality duty is constructed in order to try and ensure that we all, and this doesn't just apply to schools, that we all have regard to the need to eliminate discrimination, harassment, victimization, and other prohibited conduct, to advance equality of opportunity, and to foster good relations. And that is specifically foster good relations between people who share a protected characteristic and those who don't share that characteristic. So in effect, between disabled people and people who are not disabled. So we should be focused on fostering good relations. That plays straight into that situation where disabled pupils are being bullied disproportionately. So we need to take active steps under the public sector equality duty to address that. If we know that our disabled pupils are being disproportionately bullied, we need to take active steps to address that. Now, we're required to publish information. Now, so I'd said if the school knows that disabled pupils are being disproportionately bullied, so how would it know? Well, because the public sector equality duty requires schools to gather, analyse, and publish annually information about the effect of policies and practices sufficient to demonstrate compliance with the duties and evidence of analysis. Now, the vast majority of schools are not gathering and analysing information of this nature to inform their public sector equality duty. Just a reminder to you at this point that, of course, my focus today is on disability in the Equality Act and in schools. But of course, these duties apply across all protected characteristics. So race, faith, and other protected characteristics are all in here. So just a reminder about that. So this doesn't just apply to disability. On the basis of that information, which is required to be published annually, the school must set equality objectives. So it's something one of these issues we're going to address, and for that objective, they must set out specific and measurable objectives, taking into account the information that we've just talked about, showing how progress will be measured, setting new objectives, not more than 4 years from the date of the previous set of objectives. So you've got quite a good period of time over which to plan. And I think this is another challenge for schools. Very often schools are not really thinking in planning terms of those sorts of periods of time. And, you know, you need to take that account in all sorts of ways, how you might establish things that would help to address some of these difficult patterns that we've got. Now, the requirement around publication is also to say who was consulted when this information was gathered and the objectives were set, what they said, and how it was taken into account in the objectives. So thinking back to a school and bullying, we might perhaps talk to the pupils who've been bullied and consult them about how they think that the school should address that disproportionate bullying. How could we address that? How could we do it in a way that wouldn't? Lots of pupils say, well, we don't want you to punish the perpetrator of the bullying because it'll just make it worse. They'll come back and they'll do it more. they come back and take it out on me. And a lot of pupils will say they prefer those sort of restorative justice approaches, which actually get kids into the room talking together and prepared to talk through, how that made me feel, and what can we do to make it work better, etc. So those approaches in general are preferred by pupils who've been subjected to bullying. But the point about this here is that we need to say what engagement we have had with people who share a particular protected characteristic in our devising of those objectives. So that would help us to steer away from potentially a more punitive approach to bullying, which might exacerbate the situation if the objectives that we set are informed by the views of those people who are affected by the pattern of behaviour as it stands at the minute. So just a quick little bit about overlapping groups and overlapping duties, because there are some core duties here that really speak to each other. So under the Equality Act, that duty to foster good relations between those who share protected characteristic and those who don't is echoed by the Children and Families Act duty to children with special educational needs, which is in the SEN policies they're required to publish. They must say how pupils with special educational needs engage in activities with those who do not have special educational needs. So there are 2 points there in the Equality Act and in the Children and Families Act. And indeed, there is a duty not just in relation to information, but in relation to policy as well. There is a duty on schools to ensure that pupils do engage in activities with those who don't have a special educational need. And then in terms of pupils with medical needs, many of whom would be covered by the Equality Act, so child with diabetes or child with epilepsy, with a range of other medical conditions, are covered by guidance on pupils with medical needs, but they would probably also be covered by the Equality Act definition of disability. But under the Children and Families Act, Section 100, schools are required to have arrangements in place to ensure that pupils with medical needs can access and enjoy the same opportunities at school as any other child. And the guidance there is very, very clear about ensuring that pupils with medical needs have full access to education, including school trips and physical education, which is sort of recognised as being some of the places where children with medical needs may get left out of activities. So I think this is the last pause point. So I'll just stop briefly there to see if there's anything anyone wanted to raise at this point.
Could I just add something, Philippa?
Yeah.
The public sector equality duty falls to trustees initially. It's a sort of, it lands on governors before it lands on school staff. And that's one area where I do see quite a deficit of compliance. And it's very clear that the analysis needs to be taken place at school level. Each individual school needs to report themselves. But because the duty falls to trustees, they see themselves as a larger organisation with many schools in it and don't really do the analysis that they should at a school level. So I think there's a misunderstanding here about what's required and who should be doing it.
Yeah, absolutely right, Diana. And the for a maintained school, of course, it's the governing body which has the responsibility. But for an academy, it is the trust, and therefore it is where it's managed by a multi-academy trust. It is that trust in its role with responsibility to that individual academy. So it would be, if it is the same trust for that which it will be for a multi-academy trust, it is that trust, but in relation to its responsibilities for that individual academy where the disability discrimination may have occurred, or where they should be analysing the data from that particular school. And I think for that particular academy. So I think you're absolutely right. Very often the responsibility is seen as a sort of collective responsibility across the trust, the multi-academy trust, without that focus on the individual academy. But that is how it is in the law. But just to add, Diana, that we're very aware that very often there is a difficulty in holding the school to account for its responsibilities in relation to disability, and we've been working with the DfE on making sure that there is a greater awareness of responsibilities amongst governors more generally, and I'm not quite sure about timing, but there is a plan to try and ensure that it's better embedded in governor training, awareness of the disability discrimination duties and those wider strategic duties where, as you quite rightly say, a multi-academy trust has responsibility for each individual academy as well as for the academies collectively. Thank you.
Philippa, I had a quick question.
Yes.
So with the accessibility plans, I don't know if you mentioned this already and I missed it, but is that the responsibility of the SENCO or the senior management team to write?
Well, it's interesting. No, it's not the responsibility of any individual. It's the responsibility of the governing body to make sure it's in place. Now, it's interesting because disability overlaps with special educational needs. We just look at the data. It screams that disabled children, probably the majority of disabled children have a special educational need, and probably a lot of children with special educational need have a disability. But it's interesting that there is that responsibility at the strategic level for the school. So who does it, in a sense? Probably importantly, this might be done by the SENCO, but with other senior leaders. And where the SENCO isn't a senior leader, probably important that it is picked up by senior leaders rather than by the SENCO, because it does have to go across the whole school. And we do have to think about accessibility across all the activities of the school. So it does need to be the oversight, at least, even if the drafting is done at a more junior level, the oversight needs to be with the senior leadership team.
Yeah, but I can also see the benefit of getting junior teachers involved in the drafting, because they are the ones that carry it out as well. In terms of the accessibility plan. So yeah, even obviously if the SENCO is senior level, that's great. But if more junior teachers are getting involved, then that also is beneficial.
Yeah, and the SENCO is likely to have a lot of really helpful insights into the kind of which departments in the school are better at ensuring accessibility, and that may even that may be that school needs to allocate some resource to ensuring that the maths curriculum in year 9, it's always year 9, isn't it, the maths curriculum in year 9 is made more accessible, because at the moment too many children are dropping out of that or getting excluded from lessons or whatever because they can't engage in the learning. Okay, guys.
Sorry, I've got a final one.
Yes.
Right at the end. So one of the things around reasonable adjustments that occurred to me is that lots and lots of people talk about or have put in place reasonable adjustments, staff, etc. And often the focus isn't on kind of analysing whether they're working and how they work, and the fact that they're not set in stone. They should be in a working document that changes based on needs, and if it's not working, then we shouldn't be doing the same old thing.
it's a really, really good point, because something that you put in place at one point might stop working, or something that you might try and fails at one point might actually be the really good reasonable adjustment you might make at a later point. And I think that's it's absolutely essential that we keep it under review. And indeed, one of the things that came up in the example of the kid who got into the kid who swore colourfully to his the supply teacher at the class door. One of the issues there was precisely that. Actually, there were some adjustments that had been made, but they kind of they stopped being effective after a while. And actually engaging the pupil in thinking about, it seems to us that this isn't working as well as it did earlier in the year. How can we adjust it? What do we need to do to make sure that you can join in the lesson and enjoy your learning, engage in it fully? And keeping it under review, absolutely right, absolutely essential. Something that works at one stage might not at another.